And my name is Tom Dresser, and I'm doing a little walking tour of the town of Oak Bluffs. We're looking at it on a nice warm July day in the year 2020, in the midst of our pandemic. But we're going to take a trip back in time, back to the years of the late 1800s, and we're going to be talking about different aspects of the town of Oak Bluffs. And we're starting here at the iconic flying horses, because this is really the only solid remainder of the amusement park atmosphere, which was so popular in the late 1800s. The flying horses were originally built in Coney Island in the 1870s. They were moved to Oak Bluffs in 1884, but they were pushed up to the shoreline. They weren't where they are now. And we're going to walk up to that area where the flying horses originally were. And then they were brought down here in the late 1880s because the people were fearful that the carousel would fall into the ocean or be destroyed by the sea air. So we start here with the flying horses, but we want to take a little look around what we see from here. And one key item is that to my left, we see the little information building, and that is now where customers and tourists go to find out what's happening in town. It's at the base of Circuit Avenue, and it's an important central meeting place. But what's interesting is, years ago, when the first automobiles were going through town, this was a place where there was a traffic light. And that traffic light replaced a statue which was there. And we'll get to the statue in a little bit. But you take an eye on the information booth, and then we go and take a random view of what we can see. We see Circuit Avenue. Then we look over, we see Big Dipper ice cream, which used to be the waiting room for the trolley which ran through Oak Bluffs. We look at the Strand Theater, which came into existence in the early 1900s. Then we see Dreamland, which was originally a dance hall that came into existence in the early 1900s. And then, ironically, it became an automobile garage, and you can see the bays that are still there. And now Dreamland is a successful Martha's Vineyard Chowder Company and entertainment area. But of course, everything is different this year. Next to Dreamland, you can see the Surfside Motel, and that used to be a bowling alley. We have a picture of what it looked like as a bowling alley years ago. What's interesting about that is that the fellow who ran it, Will Jones, hired local young kids to be pin setters, because there was no such thing as an automatic pin setting machine back in the day. And Buster Giordano and his brother Richie were early pin setters in the 1940s and 50s. And that now the bowling alley has become the Surfside Motel. Now we're going to pause here and take a little walk down the street and see some more highlights. Okay, we're standing here in front of the Oak Bluffs Steamship Building, and this is the most popular pier here in Oak Bluffs. It's very busy in the height of summer, but of course with the pandemic things are a little different. Now the reason we're standing here is because this is the site behind me of where the Seaview Hotel stood. The Seaview Hotel was built in 1872 at a cost of more than $100,000. It had 125 rooms and 3 or 4 bathrooms. Only a few bathrooms because indoor plumbing was just coming into business. So the Seaview was right between the pier and the town of Oak Bluffs. So people basically had to come off the steamship, go through the Seaview Hotel area, and then they were part of the community right here. Now what I found interesting is that there was really a welcoming community here. Everybody worked together on making it fit together. This was part of the Oak Bluffs Land and Wharf Company, the pier, the hotel, and the design of this whole section of Oak Bluffs. And we look at it today and we see the steamship pier as sort of one element of everything else. But back then, the parks, the houses, and all of the big hotels all seem to fit together. Now we're going to walk across the street here, and we're going to look at some stanchions that held the original Martha's Vineyard Railroad train, which came from Oak Bluffs all the way to Edgartown and on to South Beach, a total of 9 miles. And what I find interesting about this, again, is that the train was part of the hotel, and it all was tied together. And this was great in the 1870s and 80s, but in 1892, there was a suspicious fire, and the Seaview Hotel burned down, nearby hotels and buildings were affected, and the railroad track, the turnaround, or the roundabout where the train turned around, caught fire and burned. And so from then on, the train came forward from Edgartown into Oak Bluffs, but then from Oak Bluffs, it backed all the way to Edgartown. And that was sort of symbolic of the way Oak Bluffs and Edgartown were interacting in the late 1890s. So we're going to move over here and look at this railroad stanchions. So follow me across. Okay, the posts that you see in the sand here are the stanchions that came from the railroad that ran from Oak Bluffs to Edgartown. And this was a very popular way of transporting people from the busy tourist center of Oak Bluffs to the less busy area of Edgartown. Edgartown was really very jealous of what was happening with all the people coming to the Oak Bluffs Land and Wharf Company and to the Methodist campground. So it was really an exercise in sharing the wealth, if you will, bringing the tourists from Oak Bluffs to Edgartown. And of course, in the 1880s and 90s, the train was the only way to get around if you didn't do horse and buggy. So now we'll move on to see some other sites that were here in the area. Okay, we're standing now at the site of the Vineyard skating rink, which was built in 1879, and it held 1,000 people. You could go roller skating here as a family. They had shows and events that were put on just for your entertainment, and it was a very popular public entertainment scene that was that unfolded here. Now, the Vineyard skating rink was the brainchild of a fellow from Worcester, Massachusetts, his name was Samuel Winslow. He developed the first roller skating rink in Worcester, and then 3 years later came to the Vineyard and set up our building here. And he also publicized the Vineyard in a very unique way. He was the designer of a special kind of roller skate. Who knew there was a special kind of roller skate? But anyway, he put it together in the 1870s, and he named it the Vineyard Special. And the Vineyard Special roller skate was sold up and down the East Coast and was very attractive to people who were interested in the area. And so people followed the name of the skate, came to the Vineyard, and skated in their marvelous Vineyard skating rink. Now, this skating rink was adjacent to the Seaview Hotel, and we talked about the suspicious fire which burned the hotel. Well, it also burned the Vineyard skating rink, and so the whole place really fell apart in 1892. So it had its heyday in the 1880s. Now we have three other activities that we can talk about right here, and then walk up the street and show you exactly where they were. But one that is the one that we started to talk about earlier was the flying horses. And the flying horses little carousel was originally put on the bluffs way up here, and it was right on the shoreline, and people were a little bit disconcerted that it was so close to the water, and that's why it was moved down to the intersection of Circuit Avenue. And right next to the Flying Horses, which we consider the oldest continuously operating carousel in the United States, except for what's happening this summer. But right next to the Flying Horses, back in the 1880s, was a toboggan slide. And this toboggan slide was very popular at first, and then it sort of lost its excitement, and it was torn down after 3 years. But it was 850 feet long, and if you look at the slide of the picture, people are very well dressed, moving very slowly down the slide, but it does have its own sort of charisma and charm and something unique. So it was part of the amusement park atmosphere of the era. One other thing that happened during these years was that we were the subject of a number of clubs of bicyclists that chose Martha's Vineyard, specifically Oak Bluffs, to come and ride their bikes up and down the streets that were concreted, they called it. They had already paved a number of the streets. This is before automobiles again. But these wheelmen would come from Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia or New York, and they rode 30 miles on our paved streets, and they loved it. And they created quite a stir among their own groups, and it was a very public activity. So we take a little panoramic look. We see where the great big Vineyard skating rink was, and then further up is the Flying Horses, and across or adjacent to it was the toboggan slide. And now all we have in the area is a beautiful scenic walk over the North Bluff. We have beaches that have been rebuilt with groins holding the sand in place, and we still have a beautiful, charming community. This is the site of the Tivoli Dance Hall, built in 1901. It was originally called the Cottage City Casino, and it had a number of shops on the first floor. It had a dancing bear. There was a shooting gallery, an ice cream parlor, and a number of people selling their crafts. But what we found most interesting was the second floor. The top floor of the Tivoli was a dance hall. And for 30 years, people would come to Oak Bluffs, and they would love to be up on the dance floor and swinging their partners away. And there was a band that came here from Worcester called the Novelty Orchestra, and it was conducted by a fellow named Will Hardy, and he played all sorts of songs year after year. He started playing here in 1915 and continued into the 1930s. What we found interesting was that Tivoli continued to be a dance hall into the 1940s, and an ice cream parlor, and people would come and enjoy it. And then it was torn down in 1964, and this building was erected, and this was the original Oak Bluffs Town Hall, and then it became the Oak Bluffs Police Station. So we have the Tivoli building, the high point of the dance and fun and games activities of Oak Bluffs. All right, thank you. We're standing in front of the statue of a Civil War soldier that was put together or brought here by a fellow named Charles Strawn, who was the editor of the local newspaper. He put it here in 1891 with a specific purpose of uniting the North and the South 25 years after the Civil War. The original location of the statue was down at the base of Circuit Avenue, where we saw the information booth earlier. And the statue was placed there originally in 1891, and then it was moved up here in 1925 for a celebration again with Strawn, and talking about publicly again uniting the North and South. So this statue is really a symbol of the unity that they were trying to bring after the Civil War. In recent times, it's created a bit of a havoc because it honors the Confederate soldiers as much as the Union soldiers. And with the public angst over Confederate recognition, they have taken the plaques down and stored them at the Vineyard Museum. So we just have a little bit different perspective now of how things went all the years ago. But the statue is a historic relic from a century and more ago. As we're standing here, I just want to take a quick panoramic view of what is behind me, because this is Ocean Park, and this was the premier designation of the town of Oak Bluffs when the town was laid out in 1866 by landscape architect Robert Morris Copeland. And the centerpiece of the 75 acres of the Oak Bluffs Land and Wharf Company was Ocean Park. And if you just stand and look at the houses that go around in a semicircle and all the activity that this generates and centralizes, you get a sense of how the charm and beauty of Oak Bluffs is projected when people are coming here by steamship in the harbor or passing through on the many streets that intertwine and are right around us. From here, we're going to walk to a couple of houses that are facing Ocean Park and just get another sense of what the community has to offer. We're standing in front of the house that was built by Erasmus Carpenter as a symbol of the beginning of the Oak Bluffs Land and Wharf Company. The plans for the town were laid out in 1866 when they bought 75 acres of land adjacent to the Martha's Vineyard campground. And the idea was to sell these house lots to families, middle-class families who wanted a second home, who wanted a vacation home. And Erasmus Carpenter set the tone by building this elegant house in 1867 or 68, I believe, and it cost about $10,000, which was a lot more than most of the houses in the area, because he wanted it to be something that lasted. Now, Carpenter himself came from Foxborough, Massachusetts. He was in the straw trade, whatever the straw trade was back in the 1860s and before. But he came here with this idea of building a residential community, and it was the first one in the United States. And we find that fascinating, that he was able to start it, get it going, and it succeeded to beyond anyone's expectations. So Carpenter succeeded here. He also was instrumental in building the Seaview Hotel, in building the Pier in Oak Bluffs to bring the steamship here. He was instrumental in getting the train, the Old Colony Railroad, to come down from Boston to go to Woods Hole. And he was instrumental in the Martha's Vineyard Railroad, which brought people from Oak Bluffs over to Edgartown. Now, Carpenter died in 1901, and the house changed hands for a number of years. And in the late 1950s, it was purchased by Joseph Vieira, and he held the house for almost 60 years, and his family has it today. And we're very pleased with the work that Mr. Vieira did in upgrading the house and keeping the historical context, keeping it as pure to the original intent and the original construction as possible. And the family is enjoying the house these days, even in the midst of a pandemic, it's great to be able to get together. So this is the house of Erasmus Carpenter, and we're honored to be able to show it to the general public. Thank you. We're sitting on a bench in front of the house of Dr. Harrison Tucker. Dr. Tucker was a physician who worked and practiced in New York, but he came here in the summers starting in 1869, and he built this very imposing, impressive structure. And we have a picture of it, what it looked like when it was first built about 140 years ago. And it's since taken a little bit of a decline. They've changed the architecture a little bit, but basically it still stands out as one of the more impressive structures on the surroundings of Ocean Park. Now, Dr. Tucker was a somewhat controversial character in our perspective today because as a physician, he also was in the business of patent medicine. And patent medicine at the time was something that was sort of a cure-all that was basically made up by the physician to cure anything from your headache to your stomach ache to your agitated in your heart, your depression, anything that you had wrong. And it worked so well because the primary ingredient was cocaine. So Dr. Tucker gained a certain amount of fame with his promotion of this cocaine product of patent medicine. Now in 1874, we had a visit from the President of the United States. And I'll give you a moment to guess who it was. He was coming here in search of the support of the Methodist community. We had the Methodist campground right behind us, and he came and stayed at the Methodist campground for 3 days, and he wanted to enlist the Methodists in his support in running for a third term as President of the United States. And by now you should have realized that it was President Ulysses S. Grant. And he was the first sitting president to come to Martha's Vineyard. He stayed here, as I mentioned, for 3 days. He was at a church service at the Tabernacle, and he addressed the crowd outside the cabin, the cottage he was staying at the campground. And then he came here to the house of Dr. Harrison Tucker, and he had a fireworks celebration in his honor right over Ocean Park. And we've kept that tradition of fireworks over Ocean Park ever since the summer of 1874, perhaps in honor of Ulysses Grant, perhaps because we just love fireworks. But of course, in this year of the pandemic, there will be no fireworks. Now, one thing that Erasmus Carpenter, the person who really instigated the whole Oak Bluffs Land and Wharf Company, one thing that he instigated was the beginning of Illumination Night, and that was the last big day of the Methodist campground, the Sunday service, and he would have people in Oak Bluffs Land and Wharf Company. They were told or suggested that they hang Japanese lanterns on their porches in honor of the end of the season. And Dr. Tucker and Carpenter himself and all the people around Ocean Park put up these lanterns, and they were very much appreciated by people in the community. And the next year, the Camp Meeting Association picked up the tradition, and Illumination Night has kept going since 1869. But again, this year, we won't be having Illumination Night. So we're going to move on now to the Corbin Norton House, and another big viewing point of Ocean Park. Okay, this house behind me is called Villa Rosa, and it was built in the early 1890s and was a summer house. It doesn't have any insulation or heating, and it was purchased in the 1950s by a gentleman named Joseph Overton. and he was from Harlem, New York. He was a labor organizer, and he bought this as a summer house, a summer respite for himself in the 1950s, and he was prominent in the African American community. And I find it very interesting how many different people he encouraged to visit Martha's Vineyard and share in the beauty of his house and the beauty of the landscape and the beauty of the town. Some of the people that came here you may have heard of: Harry Belafonte, the singer, Joe Louis, the boxer, came here. Adam Clayton Powell came here. Dr. Ralph Abernathy came here. And in the summer of 1961 and 62, both years, Dr. Martin Luther King was here. And Dr. King was here specifically for a vacation, but he was asked by the Vineyard Gazette to be interviewed. But he said, "I'm really too busy. I'm sitting here on the porch overlooking the ocean, and I really don't have time for an interview." So he turned down the Gazette, and he reviewed his book of sermons in 61 or 62. So the house stayed in Joseph Overton's family for a number of years, and it was purchased a couple of years ago and renovated, rebuilt, and now it stands as Villa Rosa. The owner of the house keeps it as a family tradition, and sometimes you'll see family members here enjoying the sunshine. And talking briefly about the beaches around us, we have Pay Beach, which is this extremely long bit of shoreline here that stretches from the Inkwell all the way down to Oak Bluffs Harbor, to the Steamship Authority. And where did the name Pay Beach come from? Well, in the Oak Bluffs Land and Wharf Company's original plan, they built bathhouses here. And the bathhouses had hot and cold, fresh and salt water showers, and they were heated with solar heat for the showers. And the bathhouses were used by the general public because you weren't allowed to wear a bathing suit in town, so you had to change your bathing suit here in the bathhouses. And it cost a nickel a day. And there's stories of people who had the changing situation here. They would take off their long wool bathing suits that were cold and clammy and wet, and they'd hang them up, pay their nickel, and go off for the day, and then come back the next day and put on the wet, cold, clammy bathing suits. So this got the name Pay Beach. Now, unfortunately, African Americans were not encouraged to use Pay Beach. They were told they have to go down the street a little bit farther to what became known as the Inkwell. And it was both African Americans and Jewish people that were not welcome at the East Chop Beach Club, that were not welcome at the Highland Beach, that were not welcome at Pay Beach. So there was segregation in Oak Bluffs. We can't deny that. But what's happened over the years, since the 1940s, things have changed enough so that we now consider the Inkwell Beach to be our premier beach that symbolizes integration. And we have black people there, we have white people there, and there's a real mixing of the races and a feeling of camaraderie and community. And a group of people have been coming to the Inkwell traditionally for 3/4 of a century. Since the 1940s, the polar bears have enjoyed time at the Inkwell. The polar bears are just a loose-knit group of whoever wants to come and swim, and they come here. The first swimmer will come here by Memorial Day, and the last swimmer will be here on Columbus Day. And they use the Inkwell Beach as their primary focal point. And it's a beautiful area, and the polar bears get together for communal swimming, communal exercise, and Sometimes they had potluck luncheons and breakfasts, and there's a real feeling of fellowship there. And there are people who have been polar bears for half a century, and it's kind of nice to have that tradition that brings people together, brings people to the little town of Oak Bluffs, and celebrates our past in such a glorious way. So that's a little bit of a story of the Inkwell.